It is finally that time once again. Playoff baseball in Baltimore, Maryland. The Orioles and the Royals kick off the AL Wildcard Series starting tomorrow. And tonight, we will preview everything you need to know from every angle for the series between Baltimore and Kansas City. That's coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, September 30th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to preview the Wild Card Series. Orioles and Royals, a best-of-3 series, gets started on Tuesday at Camden Yards, and I'll get you everything you need to know leading into that series. First, I'll give my final prediction of the Orioles playoff roster, which probably won't come out until early afternoon on Tuesday. So I'll give my one final kick at it, which guys are going to make the team and what roles will they be in. And then we'll talk about all the matchups. Orioles hitters versus Kansas City pitching. How the Royals bullpen has kind of been a problem, but has stabilized a bit down the stretch, and why their starters and Cole Ragans and Seth Lugo can really make a difference versus the O's hitters, which were really struggling, but got healthy and got back to it in the final week of the season. Then it's Orioles pitchers versus Royals hitters. The Royals were the worst offense in baseball in September. Will that carry over? Will they get Vinny Pasquantino back? What will the O's do as a starter after Corbin burns? And how can this Orioles bullpen, which was one of the worst in baseball in September, hold up as they get into October? We'll get into all of that coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So thank you all who have joined us here live on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel here on Monday evening. Thank you so much for tuning in. May or may not have some time to take some questions here live at the end of the show. So if I do, make sure to put your questions here in the YouTube chat, but mostly we are going to just break down this Orioles-Royals wildcard series from every angle. First things first, off the top, 3 games, or potentially 3 games. It is a best-of-3 series, the wildcard series, being played all at the Better Seats Ballpark, which is Oriole Park at Camden Yards. A 4:08 first pitch for Game 1 on Tuesday. It'll be the aces of both sides, the lefty Cole Ragans for the Royals and the righty Corbin Burnes for the Orioles. Game 2 on Wednesday will be a little bit later, a 4:38 p.m. Eastern time start. The Royals will send Seth Lugo out there, who's been kind of a 1A ace for them this year. The Orioles, it seems, would be sending Zach Eflin to the bump in Game 2, although they have not yet named a starter. And then Game 3 for Thursday, if necessary, if the team split the first 2 games, would tentatively be at 4:08 once again. However, all the wildcard games are played Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So if other teams wrap it up in 2 games, and maybe the Orioles are only 1 or 1 of 2 games remaining, they will switch those times around for TV purposes. But right now, if all 4 games happen with a Game 3 on Thursday, they'll be at 4:08. It would be Michael Wacha for the Royals. And again, nothing confirmed for the Orioles, but we would think Dean Kramer would get the ball on Thursday. So let's start with, okay, who is going to be on this postseason roster? Because you play most of the year with 26 players. You get to play with 28 in September, and then you go back down to 26 in the postseason. You cannot have more than 13 pitchers on your playoff roster. And especially for these shortened series where you may only play 2 games, a lot of teams actually go with 12 pitchers versus 14 hitters. So they can maybe play the matchups, use the pinch runners, things like that. And my prediction, now there's no telling that this is going to be right, and I took a couple of risks with this prediction. I think maybe the Orioles will go with 12 pitchers and 14 hitters, at least for the wild card series. And then if they were to advance to the ALDS, which is a longer series, a best of 5, they would switch it to 13 and 13. So let me start with the 14 hitters that I think will be on the roster. There'll be 2 catchers. We know who they are. They're Adley Rutschman and they are James McCann. Pretty straightforward. Adley Rutschman's going to catch almost, if not every single game of this postseason. There's enough off days for him to be able to do it. McCann will be there if anything goes wrong and he needs to step in. For the infielders, I've got 6 of them. Ryan O'Hearn, Ryan Mountcastle, Jackson Holliday, Ramon Arias, Jordan Westberg, and Gunnar Henderson. All of them will play a certain role. I think 5 of them could be in the lineup almost every single day, with Jackson Holliday playing a lesser role, but I'll certainly get to what he could do for this team, even if he's not getting a lot of at-bats in the postseason. And that leaves me 6 outfielders. And I went with Anthony Santander, Cedric Mullins, Colton Cowser, Austin Slater, Heston Kjerstad, and Daniel Johnson. Now, for Daniel Johnson, there's a little bit of a workaround you'd have to do because he is currently on the 40-man roster. Remember, he got called up for one day against the Tigers a couple of weeks ago, but he was not on the 40-man roster by August 31st. He was, however, in the organization. So the O's would just have to send a petition to the commissioner's office and basically say, look, Daniel Johnson is replacing an injured player. Essentially, that injured player would be Grayson Rodriguez, and you potentially could get him on the roster. You might be asking, Connor, why would you put Daniel Johnson on this roster? I'll get to that in a moment. Now, there'll be some other players the Orioles will consider. Blake Hunt as a third catcher, Emmanuel Rivera, who was so good down the stretch, Eloy Jimenez, Livan Soto, and Kobe Mayo, who all played parts for the Orioles in September, could be with the team in the dugout, kind of on the playoff taxi squad, but not part of their activated roster. So that is 14 hitters that I think the O's will go with. And again, in a moment, we'll get to what those roles could be. And we will flip things over to the pitchers, which I think will only be 12 of them for the wild card roster. The O's would carry 3 starters. We know it'll be Corbin Burns. We know Zach Eflin starting one of these games, and presumably Dean Kramer would be that number 3 starter in that rotation. So those are your 3 starters. That leaves you with a 9-man bullpen for the wild card series. Sir Anthony Dominguez, Jacob Webb, Yennier Cano, Matt Bowman, and Colin Selby would be my 5 right-handers. I think calling Selby up on that final day gives him a little bit of a nod to get that final spot. And because Brian Baker was sent down, he is not eligible for this wild card or the ALDS roster. So another bump to Colin Selby. And my left-handers would be Gregory Soto, Danny Coulombe, Cionel Perez, and Keegan Aiken. Those are my 26 players, with those guys who are in the dugout on the taxi squad but not active being Albert Suarez, Cade Povich, and Trevor Rogers, I think could potentially come back here, who could be there just in case the Orioles need them at some point. Because again, you cannot change your roster for any reason during a playoff series. You can come up with a brand new roster series to series. So if the O's win the wild card series and they get to the ALDS, you can send a brand new group of players on your ALDS roster. It cannot change, however, during the series unless there is an injury. And if there is an injury, that player has to go on the injured list, has to be ineligible for the rest of the series. MLB has to approve that basically injury replacement, and then you can put someone else on the roster. So those are my players. Again, the hitters, Rutschman, McCann, O'Hearn, Mountcastle, Holliday, Arias, Westberg, Henderson, Santander, Mullins, Cowser, Slater, Kjerstad, and Johnson. And my pitchers are Burns, Eflin, Kramer, Dominguez, Webb, Cano, Selby, Bowman, Soto, Coulombe, Perez, and Aiken. So the question is after that, okay, how are these guys going to be deployed, and what are the matchups going to be that are going to decide this best of 3 series where any little sliver of something could change it? That's how thin these margins of error will be. So coming up next, we will start with the matchups of Orioles hitters versus Royals pitchers. Who will get the most at-bats? How would the O's do against the bullpen? And with they potentially having 14 hitters, would they deploy all of them in some of those spots? I'll get to that coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And I'm not saying you should listen to me for your sports bets, because you absolutely shouldn't. But if you listen to me on Sunday night's live show, I said, you know what? Ravens -2.5. Let's do it. Well, all they did was times that by 10 and demolish the Buffalo Bills by 25 points. So that was a pretty good bet. And at FanDuel, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. And you can do it all at FanDuel.com/locked So let's dive into this wild card series. Orioles and Royals. This Kansas City team in the regular season, listen, they were okay early. They got hot in the middle of the year. They made themselves a serious playoff contender. They started to fade a bit, especially late in the year. They had a 7-game losing streak in late September, but they found their way into the postseason on the final weekend with a little bit of help from the Orioles, finishing 86-76 on the year. They were third in the AL Central, and on that final day, they were able to they were second in the Central. They were able to jump up to that number 5 seed and secure themselves a berth with the Orioles instead of having to go to Houston to play the Astros, which is where the Tigers are headed. So let's preview this matchup, and let's start with Orioles hitters versus Royals pitchers. And the one thing we do know is that Cole Ragans, the left-hander for Kansas City, will be on the bump in Game 1 for the Royals on Tuesday. Now, the Orioles have seen Ragans twice already this year. And what's been interesting, though, the Orioles really haven't faced a lefty in a big spot since they got all of their hitters back, all of their right-handed hitters back in Arias, Westberg, and Mountcastle from the injured list. They were supposed to face Nestor Cortez in New York. He got scratched. You never really know that Sunday game against the Tigers who you're going to face, so you couldn't really put together the full lineup. Mountcastle wasn't back anyway. And then they saw all righties this weekend in Minnesota, and even if they hadn't, they weren't going to put out an A lineup every time after they had clinched on Friday. So you got to kind of go back to earlier in the year to think, what will Brandon Hyde do lineup-wise against a left-handed pitcher? So if you're watching here live on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, I'm going to put up here my guess for the Orioles starting lineup. This is just for Game 1 on Tuesday because they are facing a left-hander. The Royals are going with 2 more right-handers in Lugo in Game 2 and Waka in Game 3. But here would be my projection versus Cole Ragans. I think they would have Jordan Westberg lead off in this spot. He's done it before this season. He actually did it against Cole Ragans back in April when the O's played the Royals. Then Adley Rutschman, he's swinging it a little better. He's been much better against left-handed pitching this year. I'd put him in the 2 hole. And you move Gunnar Henderson down just a little bit into the 3 spot, playing shortstop for the Orioles against the lefty. Of course, Rutschman catching and Westberg at second base. I'd have Anthony Santander as my DH here, hitting 4th, with Ryan Mountcastle at first base, hitting 5th. Still got Colton Cowser in there against a lefty. He provides so much value. He's playing left field and hitting 6th. And then I tossed and turned over this decision because he did struggle down the stretch after having a really good August with the Orioles. But I think I'm throwing Austin Slater in there, playing right field in the 7 hole for the Orioles. He's just hit lefties so well in his career. He's a guy with playoff experience with the Giants a couple of years ago. He's more of a veteran player. I think that could help in this playoff scenario. Then, despite his struggles against lefties, he's hit better in the second half. He plays an amazing center field. Defense, really important in the playoffs. I'm still starting Cedric Mullins, hitting 8th and in center field. And then Ramon Arias, been so key to this team, batting 9th and playing 3rd base. That would be my projected lineup against Cole Ragans. Now, even though Ryan O'Hearn's a big part of this team, he rarely starts against lefties. I don't think it's going to begin now. So that leaves that opening for the Orioles bench. And if you look at the players I have on the bench otherwise, you're looking at, are you going to start Jackson Holliday against a lefty with his struggles? No. Are you going to start Heston Kjerstad against a lefty? No. Are you going to start Daniel Johnson against a lefty? No. So really, it's basically, do you want to start Austin Slater in the outfield, or do you want to start James McCann behind the plate with Rutschman as your DH and Santander playing right field? I think that is a strong possibility. I'm still leaning Austin Slater because he gives you, I think, more offensive upside in this spot. But McCann has hit pretty well down the stretch, and he's been at least controlling the running game, a better defensive catcher than Adley has been, and he's caught Corbin Burns a lot down the stretch this year. So that is certainly a possibility. In that sense, you just throw McCann 9th, you move Arias and Mullins up, and of course, again, McCann catches, Adley DHs, and you put Santander out in right field. But if the Orioles go with this lineup I'm projecting with Slater out there, that's where I'm going to get to, okay, why, Connor, would you put Daniel Johnson on this roster? Here is why. If you are starting Austin Slater in this game, you're going to probably want to get him out of there as soon as a right-handed pitcher comes in for the Royals. Now, Cole Ragans is a good lefty who pitches deep into games, and the Royals bullpen is kind of more lefty dominant among their high leverage relievers, but They have a good righty in John Schreiber, and their closer is a righty in Lucas Erceg, which we'll get to in a moment. So there's going to be a chance, I would think, in this game, if Slater starts, that you want to use your weapon, Ryan O'Hearn, as a pinch hitter off the bench for Austin Slater. Or maybe you decide to use Heston Kjerstad as that pinch hitting option off the bench. Either way, if you use Kjerstad or O'Hearn in a big spot as a pinch hitter for Slater late in the game, it's probably a close game at that point if you're using them. Slater is your much better defensive outfielder. Santander is already DHing. That kind of puts you in a tough spot. You don't really want to have Ryan O'Hearn or Heston Kjerstad out there defensively in right field in the late innings of a close game. So that is why I'm saying they roster Daniel Johnson, because you could then stick Johnson out there in right field, who is a good outfield defender with speed, and he can play out there, and maybe it puts you in a weird spot where he would come up to hit again, and then you're pinch hitting for him again. At some point, you'd have to play Kjerstad or O'Hearn maybe in the outfield in this situation. So if the Orioles are willing to put Slater in there, they probably have to roster someone like Johnson. Now, I think we had, who had a comment here? I think it was Vivek here who brought up James McCann saying, would you start James McCann tomorrow, given he's facing a lefty, a great second half, and controlling the running game? Again, I think it's certainly possible. If they plan to do that, I actually think that crosses out any possibility of Daniel Johnson on the roster, because then the Orioles would have Slater on the bench as that defensive replacement in the outfield. And instead, maybe they could roster an Emmanuel Rivera, or they would roster an extra pitcher just to have someone different in that roster spot. But Daniel Johnson, even at base level, could also certainly be a pinch runner for the Orioles, a pretty speedy player as well at any given time. But let's talk now about Cole Ragans. Ragans had a fantastic season for the Kansas City Royals, one of the best pitchers in baseball this year. 32 starts, 186 innings. Ragans had a 3.14 ERA, 29% strikeout rate, 9% walk rate, more of a ground ball pitcher by a little bit, but he's fairly even. And in September, this is why this matchup is so cool, because Ragans and Burns are both coming off of amazing months of September. Cole Ragans, 25 innings over 4 starts in September, a 1.08 ERA, 26 Ks, 11 walks, and just 1 home run allowed in the month. He is throwing the ball the best he has at the perfect times. The question is, okay, how have the Orioles matched up with Cole Ragans just beyond that lineup that they're going to throw out there? Well, Ragans has actually already faced the Orioles twice this year. Now, I'm going to try not to take too much from that, because remember, the Orioles and the Royals played twice in April. Second series of the year in Baltimore, and then later in the year, or later in April, I should say, in Kansas City. Orioles took 2 of 3 in both of those series, so they did win the season series 4-2 over Kansas City, but those were some hotly contested games. O's had a big comeback. They had 2 walk-offs in that series win at home against Kansas City. They were some good games. Ragans faced the O's on April 3rd at Camden Yards. He was dominant. 6 1/3 scoreless, 1 hit, 7 Ks, 2 walks. He had 10 whiffs on 15 swings by Orioles hitters against his changeup, which has really been his best go-to strikeout pitch this year. That changeup on the season, opponents hitting just 183 against it with a 48% swing and miss rate against his changeup this year. It is certainly a weapon. The Orioles had only 1 hard hit ball against Ragans in that game on April 3rd. Now, the Orioles would come back and win that one. I believe that was the James McCann walk-off single with the bases loaded in the 9th inning, but Ragans was dealing. Now, the Orioles generally struggle a little bit against changeups. However, they're much better. Their right-handed hitters can hit lefties with changeups. However, the Orioles left-handed hitters really struggle against right-handers with changeups. That is the MO for Michael Wacha, who could be pitching game 3, so look out for that. But for Ragans, he dominated the O's. And then 17 days later, in Kansas City on April 20th, he faced the O's again, and it was a completely different story. He had the worst start of his season, and really the worst start of his career, at least since he joined the Kansas City Royals. An inning and 2/3 for Ragans. No other start this year lasted less than 4 2/3 for Cole this year. He went an inning and 2/3 against the Orioles. He allowed 7 runs on 9 hits with 4 strikeouts and no walks. He got through a pretty clean 0 in the first, and then the Orioles scored 7 runs on 8 hits against him in the second inning. He didn't even finish the second. He had thrown so many pitches that his pitch count was only around 60, but they pulled him from the game because he's given up so many runs, and he had thrown like 45 or 50 pitches in just that second inning alone and only recorded 2 outs. Now, there was a couple of plays his defense could have made, and the Orioles only had 4 hard hit balls despite 9 hits. So they did dink and dunk Ragans a little bit, but the best thing was they made contact with the changeup. They just could not put that changeup in play to save their lives the first time against Cole Ragans. They made an adjustment and actually talked about it at the time on that episode after that game against the Royals, the second time against Ragans. I talked about how that was the best adjustment the Orioles had made early in the season, that they had adjusted that changeup. They stayed on it. They looked for it. And while they weren't mashing it for 3-run homers, they were rolling it through the left side. They were punching it into right field. They were getting hit after hit after hit on that changeup. And then they forced Ragans to go back to the more hittable slider and the more hittable fastball, but really the more hittable slider. And that's when the Orioles started to feast. It was a really, really good plan that the O's had against Ragans. And again, he does have other stuff. It's a fastball at 95 from the left side, a changeup, a slider, a cutter, and a curveball. And he mixes all 5 pitches pretty well. But when it comes down to it, he's going to come at you with that fastball and changeup, especially if you are a right-handed hitter. And the O's will have a good amount of those in that lineup on Tuesday. Now, we'll preview Seth Lugo tomorrow, and if we get to a game 3, we'll preview Michael Wacha after that. But when the Orioles do face a righty in Lugo on Wednesday, Ryan O'Hearn will certainly be back in that lineup. Maybe you also see, and O'Hearn would be over Austin Slater. Maybe you would see Heston Kjerstad over Ryan Mountcastle, but I think the O's would go with the experience in that spot. Mountcastle's been swinging it pretty well since coming off the injured list, so I think the big change would just be O'Hearn back in the lineup. That kind of leaves Kjerstad as, a pinch hitter for Arias maybe late in games if the Orioles wanted to. I don't think Kjerstad will play the field much at all. In that case, you pinch hit for Arias. Jackson Holliday probably comes in defensively. Now, Jackson Holliday could start a game this postseason. It's not out of the question, but Ramon Arias is producing. Holliday is not. And I just think it's going to be that Arias, Henderson, Westberg infield pretty much every day in the playoffs. But Holliday's going to be on the roster because here's the thing. If you put up every player on the O's roster right now, including injured players, the only guy via sprint speed faster than Jackson Holliday is Jorge Mateo. Holliday is in the 95th percentile in sprint speed via StatCast. Like, he is close to Jorge Mateo's speed out there. So yeah, is it weird you're using the number 1 prospect in baseball as mostly a pinch runner and defensive replacement in the playoffs? Yeah, but that's probably what's going to happen. He's going to be your replacement for what Jorge Mateo can give you as a pinch runner off the bench. Jackson Holliday, I think, can do that for you. And that is why I would confirm that he is going to be on the roster. So that's how you face the starter. But the Orioles' goal is going to be, hey, Cole Ragans is awesome. Let's get Cole Ragans out of this game as early as possible. And it's not just because Cole Ragans is good, but the Royals bullpen is a little bit shaky. On the year, the Royals bullpen 20th in ERA, 4.13, 26th in strikeout minus walk percentage. Their 20.8 K percentage is 28th in baseball. They do not strike guys out in the bullpen, and you really need to in the playoffs. And they're 22nd in left on base percentage as a bullpen, which means when they come into jams, they tend to let those runners score as well. Now, this bullpen, it was really, really bad early. They've added to it, and they have no question about it. This bullpen has gotten better and better as the season has gone on. But at best, they're like a middle-of-the-pack bullpen rather than being a bad bullpen as they go into the postseason. It is certainly not a big-time strength for this Royals team. So the question is, once Ragans comes out or once Lugo comes out, who will the O's see out of that pen? Well, the closer is Lucas Erceg, and Erceg ended up being one of the better finds at the trade deadline by Kansas City. They went and got him from the A's. They couldn't get Mason Miller, so they got the setup man in Lucas Erceg, and he has become their closer. Now, they also got Hunter Harvey, our old friend. Harvey is injured. He won't pitch, as is James MacArthur, as is Will Smith, as is Chris Stratton, all guys who threw high-leverage innings out of the Royals bullpen this year, and all guys who are veterans. Doesn't look like any of them are going to pitch in the postseason for the Royals. So instead, they've got Lucas Erceg, who since coming over from the A's, 25 innings, a 2.88 ERA, 31 strikeouts, 3 walks, and no home runs allowed since that trade. He's got a big-time swing and miss slider at 86, and then a fastball that he can throw by you at 99 miles an hour. He'll mix in a sinker and a changeup. He's really new to pitching. He's a converted position player. Really interesting closer who's been red hot in Erceg. Then there's really 4 high-leverage guys that the Royals are going to try to go to. Chris Bubich, the left-hander who came back middle of this year from an injury, he used to be a starter. They put him right into the bullpen, and he had 2.67 ERA in 30 innings with a 32% K rate to a 4% walk rate. That has been impressive. He gets a whole lot of soft contact out there. Sam Long is another left-hander, 3.16 ERA in about 40 innings. However, Long had a tough September, 7 runs allowed in 11 and a third innings in the month. He had always been kind of a smoke and mirrors guy who, the peripherals were not backing up the good stats. Seems like that caught up to him in September. So maybe Long is moving kind of out of the trust circle for Matt Quatraro for that Royals bullpen. Angel Zerpa, though, has moved into that circle. A 97-mile-per-hour sinker from the left side, 7 scoreless innings in September for him. He is a ground ball machine. Basically, the best way to explain it, he is the Royals' CNL Perez. It is kind of a carbon copy of CNL Perez. It's ground outs. It's not strikeouts. He doesn't give up homers. He throws hard from the left side. There's command issues at times, but when he's on, he is nasty. And the final guy in high leverage is John Schreiber. We used to see him with the Red Sox. He was traded to the Royals this year. 52 innings, 3.66 ERA. He's got a 2.25 ERA, though, in the second half. And basically, he's a funky side armor with a sweepy slider and a sinker that gets him a whole lot of ground balls. He's really, really tough on right-handers. That is kind of what you should expect coming out of that Royals bullpen. So let's switch it to the flip side. We just talked about Orioles hitters versus Royals pitchers. Now how about Royals hitters versus Orioles pitchers? We'll talk about the Corbin Burns of it all. We'll talk about the O's bullpen and how this Kansas City offense struggled so much in the month of September. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Gametime. Now, I know we are less than 24 hours away from first pitch, but you may still be looking for tickets, and Gametime might be the best place to go to get them. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events, including Orioles games, even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands and thousands of tickets. At Gametime, you can get great Orioles deals, and the best part is, even if you wait till the last minute on Tuesday, the ticket, once you buy it, it gets sent directly to the Gametime app on your phone, and you can scan it right from there at the gate. Makes it so easy to get your tickets fast. They've got all-in pricing. If you turn this feature on, there's no surprise fees. The Gametime Picks, the curation makes it easier to save money, and you get views of your seats. You know exactly what you'll be seeing in the playoff action. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. So as our preview of this Orioles-Royals wildcard series trucks on, we turn things to the other side, and that is the Orioles pitching versus the Royals hitters. And let's start with Corbin Burns, he is the only announced starter so far for the O's, and he will be, as we knew all along, the game 1 starter for Baltimore. And after a tough August, a 7+ ERA, we were thinking, what is going on with Corbin Burns? Well, he fixed it. Really good article from last week in the Baltimore Banner from Andy Koska about Burns kind of changing the shape and the velocity of his cutter. It led to better command, more movement, and he's back. In 5 starts in September, he's got a 1.20 ERA, 30 innings, 31 Ks, 8 walks, only 3 extra base hits allowed in 5 starts this month. Pretty impressive stuff. He's brought that sweeper back a little bit more, better movement on the cutter. It is all good stuff from Corbin Burns. Now, just like Cole Ragans had faced the Orioles twice in April, Corbin Burns also faced the Royals twice in April. And the funny part about it is the two of them matched up in both of those games. So let's start with the game on April 3rd when Cole Ragans was dominant and then the Orioles came back to win it late. Corbin Burns was not great. I will say that. 5 2/3 innings, 9 hits, 2 runs, 3 Ks, and no walks. It It was one of the hardest hit games he has had, 10 hard hit balls against him, gave up a lot of hits, had a lot of traffic on the bases, but he kept getting out of the jams to hold the Royals to 2 runs. Although it might have been one of, if not the worst start of the first half for Corbin Burnes. It was just hit after hit. The Royals were really on his cutter for a good chunk of the night. But remember, that was the old cutter. And something Burnes talked about in that Andy Koska article in the Banner is that all season long until September, he was throwing basically a bad four-seam fastball as his cutter. He was throwing it harder, but it wasn't getting as much movement and he just wasn't able to command it as well. That was that cutter he was throwing in April. Now it's the new cutter. Maybe the Royals won't be so much on that, but he was able to grind through it. Then he faced the Royals again on April 20th, and he wasn't nearly as bad as Ragans was. He again went 5 2/3 innings, 3 runs on 4 hits, 4 Ks, a walk, and a home run. His off-speed stuff was better, and he still allowed some hard contact, but a little bit less. And it was really one pitch that changed his outing. He was getting close to 100 pitches. The Royals had 2 on and 2 out in the 6th. The Orioles had opened up a big lead. They were up 7-0 at the time. He had Salvador Perez up 1-2. He tried to throw a sinker to get it in on Perez's hands and get him to ground out to shortstop. Unfortunately, the ball just stayed over the plate a little bit too much, and Perez is a magical hitter at times, and he just kind of got to that ball down and in and looped it over the left field wall for a 3-run homer to make it a 7-3 game. The pitch count was pretty high. That was Burnes' final batter. But again, one slightly better sinker on 1 and 2. He throws 6 scoreless innings in that second start. One pitch went a little awry. It ends up being 3 runs instead, but he was still pretty good. But again, that was April Corbin Burnes, just like it was April Cole Ragans. You still have to take it all with a grain of salt because these are different teams. And honestly, we're different pitchers all the way back. That is more than 5 months ago that these two teams matched up. It makes it a little harder to predict what is going to happen here. Now with the bullpen that I predicted, the 9 relievers that I think will be on this Orioles roster, really, and we've talked about it a little bit over the past week or so, the Orioles just don't have a set closer. Sir Anthony Dominguez was that for a while, then he struggled a little bit. I think Brandon Hyde is going to be mixing and matching all day with this bullpen, including in the 9th inning. I think still, if it's a lot of righties, it'll still be Dominguez that gets the 9th. But if it's a lot of lefties, that could be a Gregory Soto spot because I think Soto is going to get the best pocket of lefties, but Cionel Perez and Danny Coulomb are going to be in that mix too. Yennier Cano and Sir Anthony Dominguez will get the best pockets of righties, and Jacob Webb will certainly be in that mix. And then I think Keegan Aiken, because at least at this point, I don't think Albert Suarez or Cade Povich will be on this wildcard roster. I think that makes Keegan Aiken, and the fact that he has been the Orioles' best reliever in September, I think that gives Aiken a chance to be kind of that bridge guy. You know, somebody leaves a start early. Well, Aiken can give you an inning and 2/3, 2 innings out of the bullpen to bridge it to the back end and hopefully pitch as well as he has over the past month. And then Bowman and Selby become your final 2 guys at the end of the bullpen. You're hoping you can use them when you're up by a lot. You might have to use them if you're down by a lot, or if you're just forced to with bullpen usage, go to those guys. You still feel okay because mostly Selby and Bowman have both pitched well since they have more later season additions, but since they have joined the Orioles bullpen. So that's how the pen looks. That's how the starters look for the O's. Again, we're thinking Eflin game 2 and Kramer game 3, but we'll get to that once that is officially announced later in the week. Now let's turn it over to the Royals offense, I should say. How are they going to combat this Orioles pitching? Well, first of all, the offense has been, I'll say, okay this year for the Royals. They're 20th in WRC+, they're 14th in OPS, they're 28th in walk rate, but they're also 3rd in strikeout rate. They're kind of like if Luis Arraez was a team. They don't walk, they don't strike out, they just put the ball in play. And that gives me chills down my spine because that is exactly what the 2014 Royals did, and it's exactly how they swept the Orioles in the ALCS that year. Now, those are completely 2 different teams. The only holdover is somehow Salvador Perez is still here in a Royals uniform, but these are completely different teams. However, the Royals just dinked and dunked their way over the Orioles in that series, and it could happen again because that is how this offense operates, except for Bobby Witt Jr. He's incredible. And he has helped the Royals to hit the ball hard a little bit. They're 7th in hard hit rate. They're 12th in slugging percentage. They can hit the ball out of the ballpark a little bit. And they are 11th in stolen bases. That is certainly something to watch with Corbin Burnes on the mound in game 1. Burnes, we know, has not done a good job of controlling the running game this year. But it's interesting when you think about it. That was a huge thing in August. That was like, oh my gosh, Burnes is never going to be able to pitch in the postseason because of this. And then we got to September, and Burnes started allowing less base runners. And guess what? I didn't hear much of a peep at all about the running game against Burnes in those final 5 starts. he is confident that he won't allow enough base runners in a game for the stolen bases to burn him. That is basically the thoughts of Corbin Burnes. And honestly, I kind of agree. So you know what? Just keep rolling like you have. But if it does happen, Maikel Garcia, Bobby Witt Jr., and Dairon Blanco, they are all in the 30s in stolen bases. No other Royal has more than 11. So it's kind of top heavy on who is stealing the bases for Kansas City. Now, throughout the season, this Kansas City offense has been fairly top heavy. Only 4 hitters throughout the entire year have a WRC plus of over 100. Remember, WRC plus, kind of an all-encompassing offensive stat. It includes the home runs, the hitting for average, the hitting for power, the getting on base. It's park adjusted. It's a really good stat where 100 is league average, and it can help you really compare players to one another, especially based on what year they are playing. And so again, only 4 above average hitters on this Royals team this year. Bobby Witt Jr., MVP candidate. He'll probably finish second to Judge. He had a case to win the MVP, led the AL with a 332 batting average, had a 168 WRC plus, also had 32 homers, 31 stolen bases, played great defense at short. This Royals team also does play fantastic defense behind their pitching as well. So that could certainly be a factor. However, Bobby Witt Jr. is the truth. He is going to be a menace out there. He might beat you. Hopefully he doesn't beat you in wins, but he'll beat you time to time at the plate. It's kind of like facing Aaron Judge where you're like, you know what? Witt's going to get some big hits. We got to get everybody around him out to win this series. Salvador Perez has been the second best hitter, 115 WRC plus, 27 home runs. He's brought his strikeout rate way down. He's not as much as a crazy free swinger this year. So that's been good for him. It's helped him have a little bit of a renaissance again. Vinny Pasquantino, their first baseman, has a 108 WRC plus, 19 homers, only a 13% strikeout rate. So he does hit for power and does play first base, but he does not strike out. Pasquantino, though, could be the X factor for the Royals in this series. He broke his right thumb on kind of a wild collision play defensively at first base in late August, and he has been out ever since. Now, the Royals thought, the messaging was basically, hey, if we get to like the ALCS or the World Series, maybe we'll get Vinny back, but otherwise he's just going to be done for the year. But Pasquantino himself said, I will be back for this team. And it looks like he will be. Now, Vinny had not been activated yet, but he's been taking batting practice this weekend. I believe he faced live pitching for the first time over the weekend, and the Royals are considering putting Pasquantino on the playoff roster when it is due on Tuesday. Now, who knows what role he'll have? It was a super quick recovery. I think at best he would DH. No way he goes out there and plays first base. But the Royals are considering putting him on the roster. I think they'll do it no matter what, just to have him in case he's okay. And maybe he becomes like a pinch hitter at most in this series. But he could be an X factor. And the last guy that's been above average, Michael Massey. Left-handed hitter with some power, plays second base, a 102 WRC plus, barely up there. So this is a team not really led by their offense and not a lot of stars in that lineup as well. And really, the lineup was already bad. But when Vinny Pasquantino went down, and that was on August 29th, so August 30th was the first game they were without Vinny. Since August 30th, this offense has been terrible. When I say terrible, I mean by far the worst offense in Major League Baseball since Vinny Pasquantino went on the injured list. In that stretch, they have a 58 WRC plus, worst in baseball. 25% strikeout rate is way up from their normal rate as a team. It's in the bottom 5 in baseball. 299 slugging percentage, last in baseball. 568 OPS, last in baseball. Only Bobby Witt Jr. with his 121 WRC plus in that stretch, because again, he's one of the top 10 hitters in baseball, maybe even better, had been the only hitter who was above league average by WRC plus in that stretch since Pasquantino went down. Michael Massey with an 87 WRC plus was the next best hitter behind Bobby Witt in that stretch. That is how bad things got for the Royals offensively down the stretch. Now, listen, it doesn't mean that that's going to continue in the postseason. We saw the Rangers kind of struggle offensively down the stretch last year, then kick it into high gear. But let's be real, though. The Royals do not have the kind of waiting in the wings firepower that the Rangers had in 2023. This has been a team that struggled offensively all year. It's not like they just went cold in September and then could heat back up. That's more of like what you're looking at for the Orioles offense, not really the Royals. So a big X factor in this series is just going to be, as long as Bobby Witt Jr. doesn't beat you too bad, can you get the other Royals out? And if the O's do that, I think they're going to win this series because there's just not enough offensive firepower in this lineup. My projected right now, I talked to some Royals people to run this by them. If Pasquantino doesn't play, or at least doesn't start on Tuesday, the projected lineup versus Corbin Burns is Tommy Pham, Bobby Witt Jr., Salvador Perez, Michael Massey, Yuli Gurriel, who they had to pull out of AAA from the Braves system when Pasquantino went down, MJ Melendez, or maybe Paul DeYoung or Robbie Grossman, apparently, because Melendez has been so bad lately. Our old friend Adam Frazier will probably start, Michael Garcia, and Kyle Isbell. That is most likely the lineup for the Royals, which a lot of those guys have been very good, especially lately. So that is a look at your series. I will make a prediction because I feel like that's something podcasters do. I don't love to do it. I'm a little biased on the Orioles. I think the O's are sweeping this series. I think Ragans versus Burns will be tremendous. I think it'll be a low-scoring game. The Orioles squeak it out Tuesday. And then I think the O's get enough of Lugo, get into the bullpen, and pull away Wednesday to not even have to worry about a Thursday game. They win this series, and they move on to the ALDS to take on the Yankees starting on Saturday. That is my prediction. But either way, it's going to be fun at the ballpark on Tuesday. And I will be there sitting out in the right field bleachers for game one on Tuesday. If you see me, come say hello. Let's talk O's. Let's be at the yard. Be at the yard. Let's cheer on the O's. Step one is get a playoff win. I was at both games last year. It was very disappointing. I want to see at least one playoff win, then at least one playoff series win, and then we will go from there for the O's. Thank you all so much who joined for this live episode. We will be live again tomorrow evening. Basically, here's how it's going to go. Whenever I get back from the ballpark and have enough time to pull myself together with the notes and the graphics to get anything ready, that's when I will go live. So a 4 o'clock game, maybe an 8 p.m., 9 p.m. live show, something like that. But we will be live on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for a post-game show recapping everything from game one of this wildcard series between the Royals and the Orioles, and that will be coming to you tomorrow night. But until then, I am Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.